This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on the activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we speak with Josephine from Abolish Frontex, a decentralised network of activist groups focused on ending the EU's deadly border regime. Josephine is going to tell us all about Frontex, which, if you don't know, is the European Border and Coastguard Agency. She's going to tell us about its many scandals. She's going to tell us about its operations within and outside of Europe, and obviously tell us why it should be abolished. We're also going to talk a bit about Abolish Frontex call for an International Day of Action on December the 18th, which is International Migration Day. And on that day, they're going to be demanding that Frontex ends its operations in Africa. So we'll hear all about that too. As usual, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, it's also a news blog with reports and investigative stories and interviews. So go to civilfleet.com to find out more about that. And if you like what the Civil Fleet is doing, you can support us by making a donation. You can make a really small macro donation or a huge massive donation if you like. You can do that by going to ko-fi.com/civilfleet. That's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Our costs are very small, but any help to platform the amazing people that we can platform on this podcast would be grateful. Right, so before we get into the episode, I was listening back to this and editing it. I realised I was a little bit off form on this episode. I'd not slept very well the night before. So I kept referring to Abolish Frontex's International Day of Action as a National Day of Action. So apologies to Josephine and Abolish Frontex for that. And also at times I keep getting things wrong, but I think that was due to my lack of sleep. Anyways, and also I'm in between houses at the moment. I'm living with friends. We're trying to move house. And at the moment I'm living with a friend, so I don't have my computer that I normally record these episodes on. And therefore my editing of this episode has not been as good as normal because I'm using a new program that I'm not used to. But anyway, I hope you'll like episode 50. And yeah, Josephine is wonderful. And hopefully my editing is not too bad. And you won't notice it. So maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. Anyway, let's get on with the show. Well, Josephine from Abolish Frontex, thank you very much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honour to be here.
So today we're going to talk about Abolish Frontex. We're going to talk about Frontex and what that is. I think we'll also talk about a National Day of Action that you have planned for December the 18th. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. It's International Migrants Day.
International Migrant. Oh, it's a good day to hold activism events then. But before we start talking about Frontex and Abolish Frontex and this kind of things, could you tell us about yourself, Josephine? Give our listeners a bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm active with Abolish Frontex, which is a network of more than 130 groups and organizations now. So we are not an organization, we are a network, right? So I'm not like a speaker, but basically an activist there. And we are based in Europe and in Africa and take actions against Frontex and against the EU's border regime. And I also work as a project officer at the Transnational Institute, which is a think tank based in the Netherlands, but kind of working transnationally and internationally. And there I work on in a program which is called War and Pacification. So I mostly look at borders and border wars and companies that profit from border fortification, and also militarization. So everything related to arms companies and also wars and very happy things like that.
How did you get into this kind of things? Like, were you always interested in migration, or like what was it that drew you to it?
I was always kind of interested in the topic, and I think I really got a bit more active when this whole 2015 events unfolded, which people like to call migration crisis, but it's actually not a migration crisis, right? It's like I prefer the term that Harsha Valia, the amazing writer, used, which is like a crisis of immobility and displacement. And then I kind of saw especially in Germany, the reaction to it, which was kind of this bit like fake liberal welcoming, which is really, really in a way condescending and it had many racist undertones, and which really quickly turned into just like, oh my God, we have to keep these people out, right? And I was just very, very taken aback by the developments and how quick all this has happened. And then I kind of got more into it, and then I also got into it professionally when I started working at the Transnational Institute. I think 3.5 years ago now.
Okay, yeah. So I know a few people that I've interviewed on the podcast have mentioned 2015. I remember it was a big year, right? I think the war in Syria was going on, and there was lots of pictures of people dying at Europe's borders. I think you're right. We shouldn't call it a refugee crisis. It should be a crisis of compassion or a border crisis, right? It was like, it's not their fault. They had to run it. They have the right to do that, right? So yeah, it also that affected me too. I remember that year very clearly and everything that was happening. I was studying a master's degree then, actually. Anyway, so we're going to talk about Abolish Frontex, which you just mentioned. I think I referred to it as an organisation, but it is a network, right? We'll talk about that. Let's talk about that later. But let's first off, why don't we talk about Frontex? I think I've done one episode, maybe 2 episodes that have been focused on Frontex, but it's been a long time. It's been at least a year. So can you give us a background on what Frontex is and how it operates, and maybe how it's funded too?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Frontex is an EU agency, right? Like the EU Border and Coastguard Agency, and also the EU's largest agency by now and the fastest growing one, which has got a massive budget now, which was founded in 2004, so almost 20 years ago, but has only been really come to the public attention and kind of become super active in the last couple of years. So I think more so since 2015. Frontex is, we kind of, at Abolish Frontex, we call it the personification of the EU border regime sometimes, because it really meddles with everything that's related to this border regime, right? It has its hands kind of everywhere. So it's like takes part in border enforcement. It actually has like officers, like it's supposed to have 10,000 standing corps of 10,000 border guards by 2027. Out of which I think 3,000 are directly employed by Frontex, and the others are kind of pulled from member states. And they're actually taking part in border operations. So like, border checks, they can keep people out. They're also allowed to carry arms. Kind of cooperate with member states on their border enforcement operations. So that's the one thing. They have these joint operations with the member states. But then they're also active in many other things. So they coordinate and also enable deportations. They assist with so-called voluntary returns, which are not actually voluntary at all. Then they kind of are really a key part of this externalization of EU borders, right? Where the EU is making agreements with third countries to like already stop people before they even reach the border. So they're kind of part of this putting pressure on non-EU countries to do so, and also to readmit people that have been deported. And then they're also kind of very active in surveillance and in information gathering. So they have these huge databases in which they basically try to gather as much information as possible about who has crossed the borders, but also who might in future cross EU borders, right? Kind of already gathering information before people even get here. And then lastly, I think they're also a bit of a middleman between the border security industry and the arms industry and member states. Like a lot of the money actually goes into like equipment which they buy or which member states kind of buy from the industry, right? So Frontex is a bit of a middleman sometimes. And I think there are also other functions that Frontex does that I haven't mentioned now, but it's really massive apparatus basically.
Do you know if so recently in the UK, I think like 2 weeks ago or maybe longer, there was an arms fair. It's quite a big arms fair, and governments from all over the world, particularly like from oppressive regimes, come to the UK and they look at weapons and they buy them here. Frontex kind of been involved. I don't remember hearing that Frontex came to that, but do you know if they're involved in those kind of things as well? Maybe in Europe.
I'm not sure if they were at this particular arms fair or at which arms fair now, but like I can imagine that they're there both as kind of potential buyers, and also, like just kind of checking out the state of security of the state of affairs of security tech or surveillance tech or something, because they're really, really involved in that.
Yeah, it's really scary, that whole industry. It makes me so uncomfortable because it's an industry of death, right?
Yeah.
And just like if that crosses over with border surveillance, it's borders stuff, it's just really horrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually the same companies, right? It's like they profit twice. They kind of profit the first time when their arms are being bought by governments and exported into like oppressive regimes or like used in wars. I mean, as we now see with like Israel's genocide in Gaza, right? Kind of the arms are being used on people. And then later, when those people kind of try to the EU to seek protection, then often the same companies profit again because border guards have bought their equipment to keep those people out, right? So for them, it's really like the best thing that can happen, right? The more destruction that happens, the more profit they make in the end.
Yeah, that's really dark. I've often thought of that as like a triangle trade, like it's like a that it's just a circular movement of refugees escaping war, and then now they're stuck at borders, and it's the same companies that profit. Oh, it's weird. Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, Frontex is the European Border and Coastguard Agency. It operates not just in the EU, right? Does it? I know it's active in Greece. I know it's active in the Mediterranean. Like, is it outside the EU? Is it just in the EU where it?
No, it's also active outside of the EU. So in since 2016 and 2019, it actually is also able to have kind of boots on the grounds, like actual status agreements. It's called with countries outside the EU, where it can do the same things, basically cooperate with the border guard and like support border guards. But even in countries where it hasn't done status agreement, it does all kind of things like training border guards, donating equipment, having liaison officers stationed, gathering information, cooperating with the authorities there. So like it's really kind of a key part of this externalization of EU borders to other countries.
Yeah, it's pretty grim. And I think we're going to talk about your day of action that we mentioned at the beginning of the show is on December the 18th, no, November 18th or December 18th.
December, yeah.
That's focused on Africa. But
Yeah, exactly.
before we talk about that, why don't we talk about Frontex has been involved in a number of scandals. That I think the last time I had an episode on Frontex, I spoke with someone, I can't remember their name, but the organisation was Fragdenstart.
Oh, yeah, maybe with Louisa, I guess.
That's it. Yeah, I spoke to them. I always. Yeah, so we spoke about that. I think we spoke about the Greek. There was a scandal involved in Greece, and the head of Frontex had to resign or eventually resigned over that. Can you sort of catch us up with that and talk about any other scandals that Frontex has been involved in, if you can?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are many. Actually, basically, wherever it's active at the borders, you see violence that happens, and people's rights are being violated, right? So it's some of them kind of become more prominent in the news, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening other places. But so yeah, maybe to start with Greece, there's this joint operation that is going on, which is called Poseidon, between Frontex and the Hellenic Coastguard, which really has kind of is responsible for like massive scale pushbacks of people, which are illegal, right? I mean, pushback kind of the term doesn't really capture also the violence involved in it, but it's basically that people who are trying to cross over from Turkey, right, either over the sea or also over the Evros River, are being abducted, sometimes held in detention centers for a while, are being stripped of all their belongings, beaten up, violated, searched like invasively, and eventually kind of put back into insecure, inflatable dinghies that then sometimes stay for days in the open sea, where people also drown and have died, before the Turkish Coast Guard eventually kind of picks them up, which is completely illegal. I mean, as we know, right? So because people have the right to seek asylum in the country where they want to seek asylum, cannot be just pushed back. And so Frontex has been cooperating there, so it definitely knows about these pushbacks that had happened. It has directly participated in them, for example, by blocking boats instead of rescuing the people there and enabling that they're being pushed back to Turkey. And also it has aircraft. It doesn't have so many boats itself because it doesn't want to have the duty to actually rescue people, right? But instead it kind of has drones and aircraft now that are flying over the sea. And the airplanes have also recorded some of these pushbacks. But then nothing has been done about it, right? It has just been hidden. And this was also the scandal over which the former director Leggeri had to step down because it eventually became public knowledge. But it has actively trying to conceal its knowledge about these things that are going on. And after all of this, I mean, all of this is now public knowledge. And it still hasn't pulled out of Greece or ended its operations, right? Because it kind of keeps playing this ball game between the member state and Frontex about who's at fault. And they say we have seen illegal things happening, but then we've told it to the national authorities, so they have to deal with it. But the national authorities kind of say, hey, the EU is supporting us, Frontex is here. So what we are doing is basically sanctioned by the EU, so there's nothing wrong. And this is the game they're playing, right, to avoid any kind of accountability.
Yeah, it's really depressing. The lack of accountability is really depressing. Like,
Yeah.
And also like the attention. I'm not sure what it's like in a German or Dutch media or media anywhere else in the EU, but the UK it barely features what Frontex does. We don't really hear about it, so I always need to explain what Frontex is in the UK because it's not well known about at all.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's the same. It's the same. Yeah, I also think we've had actions sometimes where we've handed out flyers. I've done it here in the Netherlands, where I'm based, and people just haven't ever heard the name Frontex. Like people just often don't know. I mean, for us, it's kind of because we work with it, we kind of hear it every day, but it's not really general knowledge. Yeah, and maybe just to mention one more example, because you asked about other examples, right? Because it's not just Greece, but it's also one of the most horrendous things, obviously, that's happening is the cooperation with Libya. So now we're on the topic of Africa also, right? Where Frontex basically sends the coordinates of like refugee boats that it sees at sea to the so-called Libyan Coastguard, which is really just a militia that makes a business out of abducting people and then either selling them as slaves or like kind of blackmailing their families to pay for the release of those people they've put in detention centers. And yeah, Frontex passes on their geolocations to this Coast Guard so that they can kind of catch these people and kidnap them from sea and then put them in detention centers. So this is definitely, I mean, really complicity in massive scale human rights violations. And then also it's involved in pushbacks in, I mean, Greece, we've said Greece, but then also across the Western Balkans, like wherever which was called the Balkan route, right, where people came. Now Frontex is almost active all along the route and kind of helping border guards there just keep people out and push them back, also often really violently, and sometimes keep them in detention. And then also, I think the same, there are also reports from like Lithuania and like countries more along the eastern border, like further north along the eastern border of the EU, where similar things are happening.
Yeah, it's really grim. Like I've seen, I've been following it obviously, and I think people listen to this podcast will know about some of these things. But yeah, the abuse I've read about in the Balkans is awful. It's absolutely horrific. And also in Greece and we've on this podcast we've had a lot of people from the rescue ships in the Mediterranean, and a lot of them have talked about how they'll see Frontex drones up in the sky. And then they when they see one, they think that there's a pushback about to happen or something. So it's a very horrible organisation. And I think how is it funded? I'm not sure if you said this already, but I think it has a budget of like 5.6 in UK pounds. I think it's about 5.6 billion, which is a ridiculous amount of money. Can you talk about that? How does it get its money?
Yeah, I mean, it gets its money. It's an EU agency, so it just gets it out of the EU budget, which is in the end funded by member state, which is in the end funded by our taxes, right? Like basically, it's our tax money. But yeah, it has a management board that decides on the budget and needs to be approved by the management board. And then the EU Parliament also has like some limited level of oversight, although it's not really very democratic. But it can basically discharge the budget after it's like later, right, retrospectively. So like now, what the parliament has done sometimes after these kind of human rights violations came to light is just withhold the budget. I think for like which was a year or two ago, budget from 2021 or something. But that's very limited oversight because the damage has already been done. But yeah, it's massive. It has massively increased. The budget has gone up by 7,000% or like some really crazy number over the last 20 years. So it's really expanded a lot.
Isn't it like one of the most funded organisations and like one of the most funded, I don't know, sort of arms of the EU, right? I think I remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah, out of the EU agencies, it's the biggest one, definitely. And just the money, I mean, if you just imagine all the money which the EU spends on keeping people out and violating people's rights and killing people at the borders, if it was just spent on like giving people, just shelter, healthcare, the ability to start a life here, or just also like funding everyone's healthcare, housing, all these things. It's just crazy what you could use this money for, right?
Right, yeah. And it's always crazy to me because I know in the UK, and I think it's the same in many places in Europe, is like we've got an aging population, and so there's obviously there's gaps in the job market. I hate using that term, but there's work for people to do. So yeah, I mean, people should be allowed to come here regardless of that anyway. But I just think from like a money perspective, it makes no sense whatsoever to spend all this money on violating people's rights.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really in favor of this argument of like, oh yeah, we should bring people in because we need them in a job, because I think it's not a question of like charity, it's kind of a question of justice in the end, because we are responsible. I mean, the EU is very much responsible for many of the reasons why people are forcibly displaced in the first place and why they have to leave their homes. So it's not yeah, I mean, it's not charity we are extending to people if they can come here, right? And I think migration is also a right which everyone should have, irrespective of like how the job market looks. But like, yeah, I mean, it's also a fact that like, it definitely people contribute to the economy, and also, migrant workers are like disproportionately, exploited. So they really kind of subsidize our lifestyle also in a way, right? And then still are being demonized for it, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. And so, Abolish Frontex. Like, can you talk about how did this network involved? Like you said, I think you mentioned there's over 100 groups that are involved. I think I've probably interviewed people that are involved with Abolish Frontex. But yeah, so can you sort of talk us about the organisation and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So it was founded, I think, about more than 2 years ago in 2021. And yeah, it's like a loose kind of network of groups. It's like small grassroots groups that really do like direct actions, and migrant-led groups. And yeah, those kind of groups are active up to like bigger organizations like the one I work for, Transnational Institute, that do like, I don't know, research, or a bit more, less direct action and more like theoretical work or something. So it's really like kind of a network of like really different groups that all kind of are united by this aim, right? That they think that Frontex should be abolished and that the EU border regime should be abolished, right? Not just Frontex as an organization. But so we a bit more, the network does a bit, coordination, because we see that there are really different local contexts that where people have different challenges, right? And people need to fight different fights, kind of like right now, for example, the situation in Italy is like much different than the situation in the Netherlands. So it's like groups that are usually already active in a national context, but then we try to coordinate action days, international action days, like the one that's coming up, and kind of have this website, have social media channels and so on, do research, kind of, just to facilitate the struggle in a way. So that's a bit the idea of the network.
Yeah, I think it's such an important campaign to have, I think, because we need, like we were saying, a lot of people don't even know what Frontex is. So like we need to raise awareness of what it is and then get rid of it. And so I think on your website you've got like some things that you're calling for, that Abolish Frontex is calling for. Can you walk us through some of those? What are the things that you're asking for?
Because it's it's abolishing Frontex as an agency, but also abolishing like the whole system behind it, right? Because it's more like a symptom of this, or not a symptom, but like an enabler of the system in a way. So then what we want is kind of to I can just tell you some of the demands we also have, but like it's to regularize migrants, right? To give people like legal status in countries where they reside. To stop deportations and stop detention that often precedes deportations, to stop this whole fortification and militarization of borders that we have already talked about, right, where like private companies basically profit from the misery of people, and then stop the surveillance of people who are trying to move or who are on the move, and also empower solidarity, which basically means to support people who are in solidarity with people on the move. We've seen recently that like there's a lot, especially in Italy, like a huge crackdown on like people who are, I don't know, but steering ships, or like who are then called smugglers, or who are also rescuing people who are drowning at sea, and so forth, to kind of stop this criminalization of solidarity, right? And then a bit more fundamentally also stop what I've already talked about a bit, stop the EU's role in forcing people to move in the first place, right? Because the EU is like very much through all kinds of different things, right? But like it's companies are exploiting resources and kind of displacing people like massively. destroying livelihoods. It's kind of has this really unfair trade agreements that also make it impossible for many impoverished countries to like actually ever get out of this trap. Then it exports arms all around the globe, which forces people to flee from conflicts. It supports like dictators and authoritarian like regimes that again prosecute people and like and so forth and so on and so forth, right? I think you can almost in every story of a person who had to move, probably who was forcibly displaced, you can probably make out some responsibility from either from the EU side or like some Western power, right? The US kind of does the same, Australia is doing the same in their region. So like and then the EU always talks a bit about, oh, we want to solve the root causes of like why people are displaced in the first place. But that actually, yeah, what would it mean to actually solve the root causes, right? This is kind of what we want. So we want people to stop forced displacement in the first place. Yeah, and then we call for freedom of movement for all and the end of the EU border regime. So these are like the 10 demands. Yeah.
Those are really good aims and very important, right? And I think it's always important to talk about how, like what you just said there, like the European Union and Western powers, particularly the UK as well, has been involved it's conquered all these countries around the world or continues to blow places up or fund dictators that do this kind of thing and then won't let those people, the people that are fleeing that violence that we're kind of responsible for, they try to keep them out. I think that's such an important link to make in these kind of things because they do quite often. Politicians you'll find and they'll say like we want to stop the root causes of migration, but then they kind of don't address those things. So you mentioned surveillance there as well. I don't know if you can. What kind of surveillance goes on with people how does Frontex surveil people on the move?
Yeah, I mean in different ways. I mean, so if people actually cross a border, Frontex often takes their fingerprints and biometrics and so on, right? And then there are all these databases that the EU has that kind of it wants to make interconnected now, where it saves like so people who have applied for visas also are in there, people who have like asylum seekers are in there, people who have crossed borders and then were pushed back are sometimes in there, right? And all their biometrics and kind of their application information or any information they have given. So Frontex kind of coordinates a lot of those databases and centralizes them. And now it also tries to like through this externalization, it kind of tries to make these databases interoperable with national databases of other countries, third countries that are not in the EU. So for example, some African countries, but also many countries in the Balkans or Eastern Europe. So that in theory, I guess what they want basically one day, right, is that if you have any person who's apprehended at a border, that you can check their fingerprints and then you see, for example, that they've originally come from, I don't know, Niger or from somewhere. And you can kind of find out where you can deport them to, right? And where they have come from, which borders they have crossed. And if you have these kind of agreements that say that countries have to like readmit people who have passed through this country, right? Then you can kind of push them back there. So that's but the idea, right? And then it takes all these information and then it also surveys like partially, I think, social media posts of people or like any kind of information that would make them know like which routes people might take or where like larger numbers of people might try to cross into the EU, right? So it's kind of issues these periodic reports, which is calls risk assessment reports, where the risks are like people who are like trying to just come here, and then informs member states about this. So it's that kind of surveillance and monitoring.
Yeah, it's pretty grim, isn't it? That I think I remember they have quite a lot of drones, right, that are also above the borders, like you mentioned earlier, which will be surveying people. Yeah, it's quite dystopian, isn't it? That.
Yeah, definitely. That's true.
And so, how? What are some of the ways that Abolish Frontex? How does it sort of empower people to fight against the border regime or to fight against Frontex? What are some ways that people listening to this podcast who might not know and are concerned and want to do something? What does Abolish Frontex do to sort of help people fight against these kind of things? I know you've got this action day, which we'll talk about next, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's really more of a meeting space or a coordination for like local groups that are already active. So if someone kind of listens to this and really wants to join in, I would really just encourage them to contact us, and then we can through our website, and then we can put them in touch with like a local group that is already active in their country or their region. or if there's non-active yet, like it would be really cool to just start a local group. And then they do all kinds of actions, really, from like I don't know, information workshops, going to universities or going to places and informing people about what's going on, distributing flyers, but also having demonstrations, protests against anything EU or national things that are happening, right? Kind of solidarity protests, commemorations of people who have been killed by the border regime, and then also more like direct actions, like which are actually kind of aimed at institutions that are part of the whole border enforcement regime, right? So it's really, I guess if someone wants to become active, it's really like just get in touch, and then we'll get kind of connect you to a local group. And they are kind of like the driving force, and we as a network, we are more like coordinating the whole thing, but also just like, I mean, keeping track of what's going on with Frontex, what's going on with like EU migration policy, issuing statements of our own or supporting statements, or kind of putting out research on our website sometimes to just like also keep journalists or people who are interested like informed of what really plays out, right? Kind of to cut through the propaganda that's put out.
Yeah, right. And I think your website's really good, and I like the way it's laid out and it's stuff. You can find links to news stories on there, which I'll link in this podcast as well. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that people should support and know more about. Even in this country, in the UK, where I am, where we're not part of the EU anymore, but you know, we can still work against it, or you know, fight against this injustice. So you have a National Day of Action on the December the 18th. Let's talk about, well, you've mentioned Frontex in Libya and its involvement in Libya. Is it active anywhere else? Like, is it active? I think it's active in Niger in Africa, right? And is there anywhere else in Africa that it's involved? Because that's what your Day of Action's focused on, right? Is Frontex in Africa? Yeah,
exactly. Actually, it's active in, I think, around 30 countries in Africa, right? Out of 50 odd countries. Quite more than people actually know, or more than even I knew like a short while ago, because it doesn't really talk about it as much, right? And that's obviously part of that whole idea that of this externalization of borders, that we kind of want to stop people even before they can come here. And what Frontex does there basically is to it's kind of different levels of engagement, but it has this. So one thing it does basically is that in 2010 it set up this Africa Frontex intelligence community, which is like a network of that any African country can join, in which Frontex provides like information and training for border guards, and kind of sets up ways for countries to exchange information about like migrants, or how people migrate, which routes they take, how to intercept them, or how to get their biometrics or whatever. And within this network there are like 8 countries that have now established so-called risk analysis cells that really take this whole thing one step further, right? And are really kind of supported through equipment and workshops by Frontex to reinforce their borders, and like kind of get better technology to better survey their borders, and then also make their own databases interoperable with the EU databases, right? Which I've already talked about in a way. So it's really this idea that Frontex just gathers as much information as possible about people there, and also kind of reinforces internal borders already, which is really horrible, because there are many countries in Africa, communities also, that actually practice a bit of a better vision of open borders in a way. And for example, there's the ECOWAS community in West Africa, which kind of like the EU has internal free movement for up to 90 days, where people can just go without a visa to any country. But now through EU meddling, actually this all they're starting to reinforce borders that were also once drawn by EU countries, right? By like during colonial times. So really just making things worse again. Basically this is what Frontex is doing there. And now it's trying to go even one step further. Now it has like bargaining or negotiating status agreements with 2 countries, with Senegal and Mauritania, which would enable them to actually have like border guards on the ground and conduct border checks and like keep people out, kind of similar to what it's doing in the Western Balkans already, right? These status agreements. So it's still in the negotiating stage. But yeah, this is kind of where it's going now, right? And then obviously there are also the Frontex missions, or Frontex supported missions that are patrolling the sea, Mediterranean Sea, to just keep people out, is just what we've also talked about already.
So when you mentioned Mauritania and Senegal, I think, are they going to have Frontex guards there, or are they just Frontex is involved in making those borders stronger or something?
Yeah, I mean, currently it's basically, so they had a mission there since 2006, which I don't think Frontex is supporting anymore. I think now it's only Spain, but basically where it stopped people who are already at the sea, right, and who are already on a boat. And then it's in Senegal they have a liaison officer stationed there who's also doing the same kind of training, information exchange, and so on, what's happening. But they don't actually have like armed border guards there yet or anything, or like people like Frontex officers that are actually like conducting border checks. But that's what would happen if the status agreement comes into force, right? If they negotiate successfully in a way.
It's really sad that we mentioned ECOWAS. I can't remember what that stands for. It's like East African Economic something. It's like the EU basically, an African version, isn't it? It's really sad that Europe is stopping a free movement there. That's really really depressing, because I think that was one of the best things about being in the EU was now we're not in it. You know, in the UK anyway, the free movement for us has gone, and that was fantastic. It's such a hassle when yeah, I mean, for us, you know, it's just a hassle, but for a lot of people in the world, it's just like death, isn't it? These borders, but
yeah, it's crazy. Like in ECOWAS, I mean, it's in West Africa, but yeah, it was basically also there were, I mean, traditionally just many people for work or for personal reasons or whatever were just nomadic and also just migrating for a while, right? Some were also related to like I don't know what, agricultural cycles and like periodic work and so on, and really just went over state borders. But now they are also, for example, in Niger, they are really they have basically illegalized migration in the northern part of the country completely, and then which led to, because Niger is like a really prominent transit country for people who are kind of trying to get further to the north and then trying to get onto Europe. So this is why it's such a focus for EU engagement, also for the US, but like for other reasons. But so what has happened is that they illegalized most migration there, and then people had to take more dangerous routes to the desert, and also like which led to, I think, around 5,000 people at least just dying in the desert, right? And then also because of this, like a whole transportation economy actually broke down, right? There was a local economy which was just focused on like, because it's a traditional just migrant route, so people would have like small stops, restaurants, places where people can sleep, transports, drivers, and all of this was kind of illegalized in a way, which means that people either do it like secretly now and under more risk, take higher prices, take like more complicated or more difficult routes where people are at risk of dying, or like also more inexperienced drivers kind of drive now somewhere where they maybe don't know, and then leave their passengers there if they're detected or they don't know where to go on. So it really has just like brought so much more problems to this region, right? Which and Niger was already kind of facing very many difficulties, and which obviously in the end just leads to more people having to leave, right? And then more migration. So it's just really causing more problems.
Yeah, you're right. I said East Africa, but it's West Africa, isn't it? So on the National Day of Action, what's gonna happen on December 18th?
It's actually International Day of Action. I think so. It's I mean, we see what happens. It's really up to local groups to organize themselves. But like the last 3 years, we've seen like really actions in countries in Europe, but also in Africa. We also have groups from Africa, like also from Senegal, for example, that are active. And that will organize all kinds of things from, I guess, demonstrations, dropping flyers, banners, other actions that will be more surprising that we cannot announce yet or don't know about yet. And just kind of to draw attention to Frontex and to everything we've talked about. Okay. So if people are, I mean, interested in participating, or groups are interested in participating, we also always call on groups that are already organizing something to just join in and kind of use the slogan, which is not like a copyrighted slogan, right? Like anyone can take action under Abolish Frontex. So to just kind of incorporate the demands into what they've already planned. Because I guess also for the 18th of December, many groups would already be planning something related to migration, anyone active in that field, because it's International Migrants Day. So our idea is also really just to get people to kind of inform themselves about Frontex and just incorporate this whole topic into their discourse in a way so that more people get to know about it. So yeah, this is kind of our invitation to local groups.
Yeah, and I think it's really good. I think I've seen previous stuff that's been under the banner of Abolish Frontex on it.
Yeah, if people want inspiration, they can definitely check out our website. We also have lots of photos and videos and kind of inspiration from earlier actions there.
I quite like the term. It was the first time I saw it a few years ago. Is it commemoration? It's a commemoration, direct action, right? It was only a few years ago that I heard of this phrase, but I really like that. I think it's such a good way of remembering people who have died or have been abused or whatever, and doing something about it in a positive way. I think it's a really good thing to do. I think that's everything I wanted to ask about Abolish Frontex and Frontex. Was there anything else you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just because sometimes people ask about like why abolish Frontex and now why just not reform it. So I don't know, yeah, if you want to hear about it, but because I guess comes into people's head when they hear for the first time, right? So maybe just to explain our thought process behind this is like if you I think people who think that Frontex can be reformed or that the EU migration control system kind of can be reformed, they think that it's a system that is basically working, just it has some negative side effects, right? Like, okay, we don't actually intend people to die and we don't actually intend people to be violated at the borders. These are just kind of the side effects which we have to control a bit, and we can do this through reform. But then the way we see it is basically that the system works exactly how it's supposed to be, right? It basically, like these killings or these deaths are like a calculated part of the whole system, because it's meant to basically in the end uphold global apartheid, right? It's kind of meant to keep us wealthy, keep Europe wealthy, kind of keep this wealth in which has been mostly extracted through colonialism and is still being extracted through colonialism and neo-colonialism, and to kind of keep most people out who cannot take part in this wealth, but also kind of let some people in, right, who then become kind of just this migrant labor force that can be exploited really easily because they live under this constant threat of deportation, right? So as we see it, basically the whole system is just, and borders are just kind of the instrument to uphold the separation. And so the system is just wrong to its core, right? It's just rotten to the core, and you cannot really change that through reform. So we basically just really want to abolish the whole system and change that whole system, right? Because it doesn't, just by reforming Frontex or by putting some more human rights, fundamental rights monitors and fundamental rights officers, or having more transparency, which is obviously necessary for now, but it's not going to change the actual way this whole thing operates, right? So this is really the logic behind this demand of abolishing Frontex and ending the EU border regime.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's right. I think abolishing it is the sensible thing to push for, right? Reforming it is just, like you said, I think this system is built to cause death. It's not a bug; it's a feature. People sometimes say to describe these kind of things. So I couldn't agree more. I think, so we've said that Abolish Frontex is a lot of different groups, and you said you work for the Transnational Institute, right? Do you want to talk a bit about that? Like, is that linked? Because that's linked with Abolish Frontex as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, because the Transnational Institute is also one organization that is part of the network. But what I do, I mean, we also work quite a lot on borders, and we are a research institute, basically a think tank. So we really try to just produce research that then feeds into the movement, and that people who are really active on the ground can use in their actions. So this is kind of the idea. So we've done lots of research related to borders on the border industrial complex, like how companies are profiting from this whole cycle of violence and deaths that they cause, and a lot on EU funding for borders and also for arms companies. And EU funding for the externalization of borders, and how the EU is giving money to authoritarian regimes and dictators in other countries, just to keep people out and to put people into detention centers or let them die at the border, basically. So this is kind of what we do.
Is it all focused on borders and migration, Transnational Institute? Or does it...
No. This is a small part. So this is our program, the one which I work for, which is called War and Pacification, that is focused on borders and also on militarization and arms trade and so forth. And then we work on many different issues, also related to climate, to agrarian justice, to corporate power and trade agreements, ISDS, all kinds of different issues, basically, or also fisheries, land and like everything. But basically the idea is kind of to produce research that is really useful for social movements that are working for global justice, right? So that's what we do.
Yeah, and it's really important stuff. I'm aware of it as well. Like I've been on your website a few times, not for a while, but it's a really important organisation and it does really good work. So I'll put links into that too. So if you check out the show notes, you can find more on the Transnational Institute. And so, Josephine, I think I'm going to ask my last question, the big question I ask everyone on the podcast, which it's probably quite difficult to answer. But how do you feel about the current situation that we're in and in the future? Do you think it's going to get any better? Because to me, it just seems like everything's getting worse all the time. But I know that's the wrong attitude to have. So I'm hoping you can give me a bit of hope here.
I mean, the first reflex is also to say it's just horrible. I mean, like I think it's really important to keep up hope and to try and kind of just not get completely pulled down by how bad it is, but we also have to acknowledge just how bad it is at the moment, right? And that it doesn't really look like it's getting any better really soon. But let's see. I mean, we are trying also to look at the budget negotiations for the next EU budget and kind of put some pressure there that not so much budget goes into upholding this migration, this border regime, but also other things. Let's see. I mean, I really draw, I think, hope from looking at how many local struggles are there and how many people are basically already putting abolition into practice, right? Because abolition is not just like tearing something down, it's also just constructing alternatives. So many people actually on the ground are already having, I don't know, sanctuary cities or like local like squads or groups which really practice solidarity, supporting each other, kind of providing access to all kinds of public services or needs for people. And also just going to these streets. I mean, yet now what we see with, because I kind of have to make the connection, right? You cannot really talk about borders without also talking about like what's going on in Gaza and the genocide that is happening, right? Because Israel is like one of the most, the countries in the world which is like having the most violent borders. But now seeing so many people all over the world kind of coming out and in solidarity with Palestine really also shows that people are feeling empathy, right, and are kind of fighting for their rights and fighting for other people's rights. So I guess this really gives me hope to see that we are kind of pushing. And also, I think about the border regime, I think much more information is public now than it was a few years ago. I think earlier people really were just believing into this claim by the EU that they're like upholding human rights everywhere and they're basically a force for good. And I think this image is like now getting more and more shattered. And then people are just reading about it, asking about it, and then kind of also becoming active against it, right? So I really hope that this will continue in the coming years and that we can push back against this border regime.
That's what I hope as well. Like, I think things get so bad, but it can only go so far before people start demanding change, I think. And I hope, because of what's happening in Gaza, this is one of those moments where people are seeing the horrors of what the EU and what the Western powers can do to the world. I went last weekend, and I'm going again this weekend to Palestine and a march calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, which none of the political parties in this country want. But like when you go to this demonstration, it was so nice because it was just so many different people. There was like Palestinians there, obviously, lots of people from with an Arab background or Middle Eastern background. There was Jewish people there. There was British people. There was so many people there, and it was so nice. Everyone was so nice to each other. So I think you're right. I think there's this, when we do get together, there's a good feeling of solidarity between people, right?
Yeah, and maybe just to add to this also, I think in Abolish Frontex also, as I mentioned, right, there are groups active that are actually based in Africa and in African countries. And I think that is really hope. I mean, because those are the people who really bear the brunt of all these policies, right? And so I think the work they do is like incredibly important. And I think awareness there is also spreading, like about what the EU is doing and what the EU's real aims are. So I guess in the end, any change, like we have to be as Europeans, like people with European citizenship and so on, have to push against the policies here. But then people there on the ground also are kind of pushing against it. And then if we want to achieve something, it can only work if we really, really join forces on that. But I think that's increasingly happening. And then it's similar again to like, solidarity protests with Palestine, right, in Gaza. It's the same story.
Yeah, same stuff. Well, Josephine, that was a really, really good interview. Thank you so much for your time. Before we go, what's the website? Do you know the address? I'm not sure how many people actually check show notes, so it's probably good to say the name of the website.
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks for having me, firstly. And it's abolishfrontex.org. And then we're also on Twitter and Instagram, kind of on Facebook, but not as active. But abolishfrontex.org.
Well, Josephine, thank you so much. That was a really great interview, and I'll be in touch.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and good luck with the coming podcast episodes.
All right, that was episode 50 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks again to Josephine and everyone involved with Abolish Frontex for organising this interview. It's really great, and I do hope that everyone listening will get involved in the International Day of Action on December the 18th. What do we need to talk about at the end? Let's talk about go to civilfleet.com for news reports, investigative stories and interviews, all about the activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe. Do help us out if you like. If you'd like to make a micro donation or a huge donation if you like, you can go to co-fi.com/civilfleet. We don't charge anything for this podcast. Obviously, we don't have any adverts on it or anything like that. It's totally free, and it should continue to be that way. But if you would like to help us to continue to platform the amazing people that we do, then you can make a small donation there. You can buy me a cup of coffee. I think that's what the co and co-fee stands for. Anyway, that's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Any donations that you make will be greatly appreciated. Right, I'm not sure when the next episode will be out. I'm really lucky, I'm going on holiday soon, so hopefully we'll have an episode out in December. I'll keep you updated. Follow us on social media and all that kind of stuff, and you'll find out more. Right, hasta luego, bye bye.